Now we're going to tie a Muddler Minnow. This is a little more complicated streamer pattern, but it's a pretty versatile fly. You can fish it as a dry, you can imitate a hopper or a stonefly, or under the water you can fish it as a sculpin imitation or a small minnow. For the tail we're going to use mottled turkey wing quill feathers. We're going to use 2 sections and match those up. The body is going to be some mini flat braid in gold color. Our underwing is going to be tan calf tail. You can also use natural red squirrel tail. We're going to use more of that same turkey for the wing, and we're going to do a spun deer hair head and collar. I'm going to use 3/0 monocord thread, and we'll be tying it on a Tiemco 9395 ring eye streamer hook. That's a 3X long, 2 extra heavy hook. I'm going to start the thread about 1/3 of the way back on the hook shank. I want to make sure to leave the front end of the hook completely bare for the time being so that we've got plenty of room to do the spun deer hair head when we get to that end of the fly. And leave my thread hanging just short of the point on the barb. Now I'm going to grab my 2 turkey feathers and I'm going to clip out 2 sections that are just a little narrower than the gap of the hook. So I've got one there, and I want to cut these from like sides of the feather. So the short side in both of these cases, these are both nicely modeled here. This is a little light. Trim equal sized pieces from matched sides of the quill. And you can see how these two feather fibers start to curve away from each other. We're going to cup those two together and match them up at their tips. If you can get your scissor blades between them, that's probably the easiest way to glide those together smoothly. We want these to appear as one unit, but we want that pretty modeling on the outsides of both. So we've got a nice little humped piece, and I like to start with a pretty wide piece here. You can see how those are cupped together where they look like one piece now. I'm going to measure this about 1/3 to 1/2 shank. I'm going to set it in on top of the bend, and this is also how you do a wet fly style wing. This is a little tricky because we've got to stack all these fibers that we've got from the bottom to the top and try to get them pinched down one right exactly on top of the other to keep this tail section stacked nicely and making a nice tail. I'm going to lay these 2 in at the bend. I'm going to bring my thread up over the feathers and down on the far side of the hook with a pinch wrap, but I haven't applied any tension yet. I'm going to bring that down and back up again, and now I'm going to pull up on the thread to crease that feather down. Most of this thread maneuver goes on inside my finger, so it's hard to show, but you can see that I've closed that loop from the bottom to the top. Once I've got that loop closed, I can anchor down a little further before I let go to make sure nothing's going to move. Now you can see our butt ends come just short of our thread start there, so I'm going to go ahead and let those become our underbody so that I don't end up with a lump as I come forward. So I'm just going to wrap forward over those, and you can see how those will lie down flat along the shank, making a nice smooth underbody. Now you can use flat tinsel for the body on this fly, but I don't find it nearly as durable as the braid. This braid makes a little easier job of the overlap and keeping everything smooth. And there's a few little tricks to this as well. I'm going to tie this braid in at the front with several tight turns. I'm going to start wrapping it at the front end and wrap back to the bend. So we're going to make a 2-layer tinsel body here. And I'm just slightly overlapping these wraps as I go. And then I'll reverse and come forward again. You can see how this is building up a nice heavy body with a good amount of flash in it, but it's remaining relatively smooth. Now I don't want to come any further off the front of that thread base than I already have, so I'm going to tie that off short, making sure to keep that front third of the hook bare, and I can trim that off flush there. Now I'm going to build a thread base up about halfway into that bare shank section, but I'll leave the thread hanging right on the front edge of the tinsel body. This is where we're going to put our underwing in. I'm going to take a sparse clump of this tan calf tail, clip it out from the tail, and I'm going to clean out any extra long hairs and any extra short hairs. This is just going to add some volume to the fly, but we don't want it to create a lot of bulk on the shank. I also don't want to stack this hair. I want it to remain a little ragged here on the ends. We don't want it real square cut and artificial. We're going to take this bunch of hair and measure it just short of the end of the tail. We might have a few stragglers that'll stretch back to the end of the tail, but just short of the end of the tail. And I'll take this clump of hair and tie it down right at the front edge of the tinsel body with a nice solid band of thread. I'm going to lift the butt ends of that up and trim those at an angle. And I'll wrap down over the butts to make a smooth transition from the bigger diameter of the body down onto the bare hook. So we've got our little underwing there. Now we're going to cut a couple of wing segments from this turkey quill, and we want to measure and see if we can get enough length out of this feather down here to reach to the end of the wing or the base of the tail, and we're going to be real close there. So I'm going to move up just a little bit further up the quill to get a little longer section of feather, and I'm going to cut a piece much like we did for the tail and just about as wide. I'm going to cut one from each side of the feather. Like so. So I've got a match set. I'll match these two feathers up so that their tips are even. And I'll sort of hump up this wing a little bit by just stroking it in my fingers to where it's in a nice cupped shape like this. You can see how the curvature of the tip of the feather will just blend right into the curvature of the tail. I'm going to set this wing in on top of the hook, maybe just a touch wider than I want to be. So I'm going to separate out just a few fibers here and pull those off. I'm going to set this in on top of the hook. My thread's hanging right at the base of the underwing. And I'm going to do the same maneuver that we did before. I'm going to make a wrap around and tighten up from the bottom. Make that band of thread to make sure everything's anchored down there. And now we've got the bulk of those butt ends to contend with. So I'm going to come in and trim those off as close as I can and wrap down over the tapered butt. You can see we've got a relatively sharp shoulder at the front edge of the fly here. We want to make sure we've got some room there to put our deer hair collar in and then spin our hair head in front. Now, just as a matter of being careful about what we're doing, I'm going to put a whip finish in here just in case we break the thread during the rest of the process. It's never a bad idea to do. You could even cement this and do these in stage ties this point and then come back in and do all the deer hair work later. So now we're going to do our spun hair head. So I want to make a thread base now. We've left that space bare in the meantime, mainly just to reserve it so we didn't creep into it by accident. So I'm going to make a thread base all the way up to the hook eye and back again. One of the most common misconceptions in fly tying is that you've got to have a bare hook shank to spin deer hair on. Frankly, I think that's the worst thing to spin deer hair on because it'll never stop. It always wants to slide around. Having a thread base will give your hook some texture and give the hair something to grab onto. I'm going to take not too heavy a clump of deer hair here. I'm going to hold it by the very tips and clean it out. Get all the underfur and short hairs out. I'll put this tips down in my big stacker. Just give it plenty of room to move around. Give that one more shot to square them up. And I'll take this clump of hair and I'm going to measure it about a half a shank long. I want these tips, when I tie this in from my thread point here, I want these tips to extend about halfway up the wing. So I want to make sure I have at least that much hair. I don't need all of these butt ends, so I'm going to trim some of these off. I'll use my longer hair scissors to do this. I'll just make a nice clean cut straight across the ends. And I'll take this clump of hair. My thread is hanging just at the end of that thread bump from where we tied in the wing. I'm going to set this hair in with the thread in the center of its length, and I'm going to put 3 turns around the hair. Now I'm going to hold on to the hook shank while I do this so that it doesn't bend as I pull on the thread, but I'm going to draw the thread toward me and slightly back and let the hair rotate around the hook and flare in place. And I can work forward with the thread through those butt ends to further anchor everything down tightly. You can see how that hair stands up as I wrap forward through it. Now I'm going to push all of these butt ends back and expose the front end of the hook shank and just creep my thread up to the front of that bundle of hair. We're going to tie in one more clump of hair here just to finish off the head. And depending on if you want to fish the fly dry or more as a streamer pattern, you can determine how much hair you want to put on the fly. A floating fly, more hair is going to help it float. A sinking fly, you want to probably do a little less hair and leave it trimmed a little longer so it'll have some volume and push some water, but not be hard to sink. What I've done here now is I've got a bigger clump of deer hair, or actually it's about the same size clump of deer hair, but I'm working from the butt end, so these are larger diameter. And I'm not worried about the tips on this bunch, so I'm going to cut those off as well. I'm going to take this clump of hair, I'm going to fold everything back, my thread's hanging right at the front edge of that first bunch of hair. I'm going to take the center of this bunch of hair and overlap it on the first bunch. I'm going to take the 3 turns. I'll just crease that first turn, and the reason I pull on that first turn is just to crease that hair enough that the next 2 wraps will go right on top of that first turn. So everything's stacked up there. I'm going to hold onto the shank again and flare the hair toward me as I work my thread forward through those butt ends. And you can see as I pull on that thread, that hair flares and spins around the hook shank. Kind of push everything back here. I want to make sure I'm getting everything anchored. I'll slide all that hair back, bring my thread right up behind the hook eye, and I'll whip finish here. Now to trim this fly, we're going to go back to our double-edged razor blade. I'm going to hold this in my fingers as much as I can here. And there's a few different schools of thought on the shape of the head. I like to bend the blade and work from very tight bends up into the collar, and I'll stop just short of the collar, maybe even leave some of those hairs right at the base of the collar. I can come back and clean those up with my scissors later. I just don't want to take the chance of trimming those tips off. I want sort of a cone-shaped head. You can see where we're working toward that end here. These blades are very sharp and push right through the deer hair. And I'll just work from each side back. I'll just kind of blow the loose ends off the fly as I go so I have a clear view of what it is I'm doing. Then I'll come in with my finer tip scissors. I'll try to do this in the vise where it's a little easier to follow. And you can see if I pull this collar back, there's some loose little butt ends of hair that we didn't get trimmed. We'll need to do this way. I'll pull that collar back out of the way, and I can just come in with my scissor tips and trim those hairs out along the back edge of the head, just to square and clean everything up a bit. If you've got anything sticking in the hook eye, now's a good time to trim it. A few final little trims. Get the last of these butt ends out of the collar. These really make no difference to the fish, but it does make the fly look a lot nicer. I'm going to rearrange our wing a little bit, and that's our finished Muddler Minnow.